This lecture will trace the last of the emperors in the High Empire and lead us to the transition to the Late with the Antonines and the Severans. Now, the High Empire would last until 192, and we will discuss the Antonine family that would adopt as well as Trajan and Hadrian to continue the succession of able administrators. This is not the case when we transition to the Late Empire, for we find that Marcus Aurelius is going to allow his natural son to take over Rome as an heir. In 138 Common Era, Hadrian would adopt 51-year-old Antoninus Pius, who rules for over 2 decades, but he only adopts him with the stipulation that Antonius also adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. This would assure a peaceful succession and would show the people of Rome that there is individuals that are going to take up the mantle once the current emperor dies. Therefore, at Antonius's death, Aurelius and Verus become the very first co-emperors. Here we have the newly created Antonine family portrait. At the far left, we have a beardless 17-year-old Marcus Aurelius, who is next to Antoninus Pius, bearded after his Antonine father, right, Hadrian. His arm is going to be around Verus, this child who is going to rule briefly alongside Marcus Aurelius. Then we have Hadrian, who is bearded, and finally Faustina the Younger, the future wife of Marcus Aurelius. Now, this is going to be taken from a classicizing model and style like the Areopagus Augusti, but it is non-narrative. Thus, it's foretelling already the rejection of classical art, for they are standing and facing directly out at the spectator, instead of moving behind this shallow stage-like space and interacting with one another. Instead, it is much more iconic in its presentation. Now, Antonius is very devoted to his wife Faustina the Elder. Now, when she died, he erected a temple to her and for her worship on the Via Sacra, right next to and modeled after the temple of Julius Caesar. This is at the heart of Roman politics and of Roman life in the Forum right next to the Colosseum. Here, the Forum represents the public life of Rome and of the Roman power elite. Here we find the Temple of Faustina the Elder, which is a very unique and interesting structure in the Forum, for it is an ancient Roman temple that was converted into a church. In the Middle Ages, it was turned into San Lorenzo, and then in 1602, this Baroque facade with the broken pediment was added, with the cross surmounting it, showing that it is distinctly Christian. It maintains this traditional Roman temple structure with 6 Corinthian columns in the front, along with an unadorned cella or naos in the center with the cult statue to the deified dead. Here is what the original structure would have looked like when they add the emperor as well to the apex of this pediment. Here is the Temple of Julius Caesar that was right next to it, obviously showing the precedent for the 6th column model and temple front. Now, in 1602, when the Baroque facade was added, the ground level had risen so much that it had buried the temple podium, thus where the stairs are going to reach their climax to the original temple entrance. So we know that the columns also were buried halfway up with earth, and that is why the doorway that was added in the 17th century is so far off the ground today after modern archaeological excavations removed all of the excess dirt around it. Now, this is the first monumental shrine in Roman history to honor a woman in a prominent location, a very unusual structure. Now, when Antonius himself dies 20 years later, his sons rededicate this temple to the worship of both of the newly deified gods, both the emperor and the empress. It is at this time that it becomes an important shrine where engaged couples would come to take oaths of fidelity here to Concordia, the goddess of harmony, to ensure that they have a happy marriage, and overseen by these gods, the emperor and empress, who were so much in love with one another. Now, at the death of Antoninus Pius, the sons are going to erect a memorial column right next to the Pantheon for him on the Campus Martius. The column does not survive that they commissioned. However, the pedestal that supported the column does. So the base survives with a dedicatory relief on the back and an apotheosis, while the front shows a decursio. On the sides, we'll show you this here in a second. The apotheosis of Antonius Pius and Faustina, the emperor and empress, is going to sum up the classical tradition with these figures, all idealized and with allegories here. A psychopompos, or this angelic figure, is going to carry Antonius and Faustina to heaven, given that that's what an apotheosis is, being carried up to heaven. We find that they are shown together even though they died decades apart. The figures on either side, the eagle showing us that Jupiter, the king of the gods, is going to be witnessing this apotheosis, which takes place at the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars. Showing where we are in the lower left-hand corner, we have a masculine figure with the obelisk erected by Augustus in the middle of the field. To the right, we find Roma or the personification of the city of Rome waving goodbye to the emperor and empress as they ascend to heaven. The she-wolf on her shield and exposed breast, identifying her as an allegory instead of an actual woman. Now, even though they died 2 decades apart, this is going to be appropriate for the Roman religion, and it suggests, very unusually, that Antonius Pius was faithful to his wife for the 2 decades after she died until his own death, and that they would be reunited in death, as we looked at earlier in the portraits of husbands and wives, as here shown with the Gessius Publius sculpture and relief. Also illustrating the love that Antonius had for his wife, he has a temple dedicated to her that's going to serve married couples, and they take their vows here. The relief shows us the classical tradition with elegant, well-proportioned figures on a single ground line. We understand them all in one space. They are understandable and legible from one direction, much like classical art as seen on the Parthenon. The decursio, however, on the back of this pedestal is going to break with tradition, showing us the anti-classical direction art will take in the late Empire. The decursio, as shown on the sides here and back, is going to be a ceremony performed by the Roman cavalry. This is where they ride in a circle, surrounding soldiers with the Roman standards and standard bearers. The ground is the whole surface of this relief on which these horse and riders are going to float. These floating ground planes are going to remind us of earlier plebeian funerary art, such as the relief with the funerary procession we looked at. Here we find that plebeian art is never going to be adopted by the emperors until we get to the end of the High Classical era, when Roman artists and patrons seem to be dissatisfied with the solutions of classicism and are looking for another way to show the legibility of figures riding in a circle. Hence, even though we cannot see them from one perspective and on one ground plane because they are floating here, it does suggest that the clarity of what is happening is more important than narrative legibility or representational art. As with the family portrait, here we see the dissatisfaction with classical art becoming quite evident. However, We must remember that even though it's going to become more and more clear that the classical approach to art will be abandoned here, especially during the late Empire, the preference for the classical does continue in imperial art until the end of ancient Rome. One of the co-emperors that commissions that anti-classical pedestal is Marcus Aurelius. He ruled alongside Lucius Verus until Verus's death in 169, when Aurelius will rule by himself until 180. He is the last of the 5 good emperors, and is a Stoic philosopher, otherwise known as the Philosopher Emperor. He breaks very radically with the classical conventions of his predecessors, and his portraits are going to reveal the character associated with the emperor. This will become the model for the late imperial portraits. In what would become one of the most influential and famous equestrian statues in all of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we give you the surviving bronze hollow-cast equestrian monument of Marcus Aurelius. Standing 11 feet 6 inches high, we have an example here that is very rare, very unusual. We find that it survived being melted down like all of the other bronze portraits of emperors in the Middle Ages because it was mistaken for a portrait of Constantine. So we know that Roman emperors and/or the Holy Roman Emperor in the Middle Ages, as well as popes and other rulers, when they would have an equestrian monument commissioned, they would reference this one here. With the larger-than-life size bronze with a small-headed horse, the rider is larger so that we can actually read who the individual is. They are the primary subject here, not the horse. The horse, importantly, will always represent the populace that a ruler is going to be in charge of, showing us how powerful he is if he can control that unruly beast. Below him, we have a suggested cowering enemy that Marcus Aurelius is granting clemency to and/or not condemning to death. The gesture, again taken from the late classical era of Greece, is going to engage with us in front of this monument with the emperor towering over us, and also revealing something about his character. Like his other portraits, we realize that Marcus Aurelius is going to reveal the strain of warfare in his portraits. He is often shown as weary, saddened, and/or worried, showing us this is the beginning of the end for classical art. We no longer have perfectly self-assured rulers who feel no fear, pain, and/or weariness. Now, Marcus Aurelius is known as one of the last good emperors because at his death he does not appoint an able administrator to take his place, and instead lets his own son Commodus rule, who then deposits his remains in the mausoleum of Hadrian, today's Castel San Angelo. So, given that Commodus was not adopted in the same way that Marcus Aurelius was, we find an immediate shift to the older type of rulers that, in the words of chroniclers of the day and historians, who was dishonorable, cruel, and lewd. He becomes a tyrannical ruler over his subjects, like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian had been, and shows himself in a very inappropriate way as gods or demigods, such as Hercules. He even considered himself to be Hercules incarnate and had the Senate give him the title Hercules Romanus and declare him a god, renaming all of Rome the Colonia Commodiana, or the colony of Commodus. So here we see that he continues on the bearded tradition from his philosopher Antonine father and the half-lidded psychological inferences that one can gain from this new approach to portraiture that appreciates psychological insight. He is shown in images like the bust of Commodus in the guise of Hercules here, holding the golden apples of the Hesperides, the last of the 12 labors, thus showing that the gods granted him immortality, just as the Senate would grant him the title Hercules and name him a god. Supporting the bust below, we have two kneeling Amazons and an Amazonian shield with a globe crossed with cornucopias, showing, just as earlier Augustan Rome, that there is a source of plenty when he is in charge. When Commodus rules as emperor and conquers the world, that there will be plenty of abundant food and peace and prosperity with Romans. Of course, the Amazons are here because one of the labors of Hercules was to get the belt of the Amazonian queen. So just like we have the military victories and the promise of peace and prosperity in the Pax Romana, originally the Pax Augusta, with the portrait of Augustus as general at Prima Porta, here we have the same promise with Commodus.
Commodus is going to be assassinated, bringing the Antonine dynasty to an end. The philosopher emperor's son had been the first in centuries to rule, being the blood relative of an emperor. Before him, we find emperors are going to adopt these very well and accomplished rulers to become emperor. Now with Commodus, we have a megalomaniacal ruler that displays the same character flaws as Nero and Caligula. But regardless, Commodus is going to inherit an empire that is already in decline. The economy is declining, the frontiers are rebelling, the bureaucracy that governs ancient Rome is disintegrating, and the official state religion, which was polytheistic, placing the emperor at the head of this religion, is losing ground to Eastern mystery cults, such as Mithraism and Christianity. This undermines the authority of the Roman emperor and the entire structure the Roman emperor is and the empire is built around. This leads us to the late empire, where all of these various religious, economic, and political issues come to a head.
Now, even though Commodus had been assassinated, civil war is averted for a brief time because the Senate is going to meet and proclaim Publius Helvius Pertinax, the Praetorian prefect, or the head of the Praetorian Guard, the secret service of their day that protected the emperor. They hail him emperor in 192. Now, he had been party to the assassination on Commodus, so by early 193, the Praetorian Guard, ironically, also turned against Pertinax and had him murdered as well. The civil war that followed was inevitable and would lead to the African-born general who is going to set up a Severan dynasty, who has the support of 16 legions, marching to Rome and having the Senate's support and proclaim him emperor. This emperor is named Septimius Severus, who would then avenge the death of Commodus and Pertinax, purging the Praetorian Guard who had assassinated two emperors, filling their ranks with new soldiers loyal to him from the Danube region. He would establish a new dynasty that would last for half a century, claiming to be the deified son of Marcus Aurelius, brother of Commodus, and then had Commodus deified in turn, canceling his damnatio memoriae, rewriting history as it were, in order to ensure a peaceful succession appeared to happen, that he was the son of Marcus Aurelius. He was the brother of Commodus. Therefore, there was no break in this line, in this tradition. So he would rename Caracalla, his elder son, Marcus Aurelius Antonius, and also show himself in the same guise as his Antonine father, just as Commodus had, with long hair, the long hair of a philosopher, and the long beard of a philosopher in the same way. To show this transition is going to be natural and peaceful, that he was in fact the son of Marcus Aurelius.
In his only preserved painted portrait, here we have the family, the Severans, including the empress, the emperor, and their two sons, painted in tempera or using egg yolk. The family shown here includes his wife Julia Domna, the daughter of a Syrian priest, as well as their sons Geta and Caracalla. He reveals his age, that Septimius Severus does, by showing gray hair and how he is associated and close to his Antonine father Marcus Aurelius. Looking carefully at the painted family portrait, one notices fairly quickly that there is an aberration. One of the sons' faces has been erased, literally. We know that later on, Caracalla would have his brother and his brother's wife murdered. Now, this, of course, is standard practice among royal families to ensure that the offspring of his brother could not challenge his right to rule, nor his son's right to rule. He also had the Senate damn his memory. This is known in ancient Rome as damnatio memoriae, or the damnation of memory. Now, the idea of chiseling someone's face off of monuments and striking through their names in official records is not new. We have record of it going back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, to where unpopular rulers like Hatshepsut and Akhenaten are going to have their statues destroyed. However, the Romans developed this into a political tool and are going to systematize the practice. They have entire bureaucratic offices dedicated to destroying someone's memory.
The hometown of the Severans was Leptis Magna on the coast of Libya. Here he's going to return and construct harbors, a forum, and a basilica, as well as an arch. This arch of Septimius Severus, erected in 203, is going to be unique, for it has friezes on all four sides of the attic, as well as a new broken approach to half pediments. This abandons the classical temple front model from the Greeks, and we find further abandonment of classical models in the relief sculpture. Here, with the chariot procession of Septimius Severus, we have a 5-foot high relief showing a subject that is quite common going back to the Arch of Titus, and illustrates the first two sons in 203. In it, we see this late antique style evolving, as we saw with the commissions of the Antonines in the last class, whereby we see it is iconic. The figures, instead of looking forward and moving from left to right, are facing frontal. We have this rigidity in the forms that are halting the motion. And it is important to note that we do not have a connecting ground line, that figures seem to be both placing their feet on the lower level and on a ground line in the center of this composition. This is much like the column that would be erected to Antoninus Pius at his death by his sons, whereby we have these floating ground planes and ground lines. This is very different from the processions with the triumphal re-entry into Rome of Titus after conquering Jerusalem and Judea, whereby we see the horses overlapping yet moving forward, as well as the figures all on the same ground plane. Motion seems to be possible here, where it is not in the chariot procession of the Severans. So the stillness, which is going to be so dominant in this late antique style, is going to halt the rushing motion that we saw earlier in the sense of urgency. This is going to be common in private art, especially of freed slaves, and this new aesthetic will adopt it as a byproduct of the social and political and economic upheaval that we see happening in the late empire, with the frontiers rebelling with all of the uncertainty. Now, on his deathbed, we know that Septimius Severus tells Caracalla to mind the legionnaires and to ignore everyone else. And this is certainly going to be taken to heart by the new emperor. Now, Caracalla is going to be quite ruthless. He has his brother and wife and father-in-law murdered, as well as making every free man in the empire a citizen in order to increase taxation. He raises pay as he is raising taxes for the troops, thus honoring his father's dying wish, and he will be assassinated in the 6th year of his reign, as well as many others that will follow him shortly in the 3rd century. Now, we find that Caracalla is going to have created, in a retrospective fashion, images of himself as a child acting as Hercules, much as Commodus had. Here we have this pudgy child with tousled hair who chokes snakes in each hand, as Hera sent them into his bed as a child to kill him. Now, this is very close to the Antonine imperial prototypes established by Commodus, whereby he is showing that he is Hercules incarnate and is strong, therefore one should think twice about assassinating him. Now, when he shows himself as an adult, he chooses this close-cropped hair to associate himself with the soldiers of that era. The short beard now is also very different from Marcus Aurelius and the Aurelian tradition. So we find that it's actually cut in negative, not positive relief, showing it's a very short cropped beard. So he is like a soldier ready for battle. If we look to the portraits of Marcus Aurelius, we see how we have shifted from the philosopher type to the soldier type. Thus, he's trying to associate himself with those he would need to ally himself with, the military. Now, we see here that he's abruptly turning his head over his shoulder, and for us, this foretells the fact that he will be assassinated, just as all of Aurelius's successors would be, except for Septimius Severus. The X shape that we have here, as he looks suspiciously backwards and turns, engages the surrounding environment and is supposed to show us how fearsome he is and how we wouldn't dare attempt to plot an assassination on him. Here we have the suspicious nature of the emperor shown, which is charged with emotionalism, revealing the character, which is like Marcus Aurelius in the portrait tradition he set up, which gives us psychological insight into this emperor, who is understandably suspicious of those around him. Now, in the capital, we know that he will curry favor with the public through restoration projects and new construction, just as Hadrian had. Now, Vespasian's Templum Pacus and as well as the Baths of Caracalla are going to be those most closely associated with this emperor. He creates, in fact, the largest bathing and recreational complex in the capital. This is going to be along the same lines as Vespasian building the Colosseum to curry favor with the public after the very unpopular Emperor Nero was accused of burning Rome. Please take a moment at this time to watch the video Engineering an Empire, showing how these massive projects were going to be undertaken and how important the baths were to Roman culture.
In the capital, Caracalla very rightly is going to curry favor with the public, just as had earlier emperors such as the Flavians when they built the largest amphitheater, the Colosseum. So too would Caracalla build the largest bathing and recreational complex in Rome. The so-called Baths of Caracalla are going to leave a lasting reminder and impression on the cityscape of Rome, its towering 140-foot tall walls still standing today. The brick-faced concrete is going to be 50 acres in total and could accommodate 1,600 bathers at a time. An immense structure, and it was not only for bathing. The entire structure and complex would have been a small city, taking into account it has recreational areas to bathe, to steam, to exercise, it has tennis courts, it has libraries, audience halls, lecture halls, and then of course gardens surrounding this entire complex. The baths themselves in the center are going to be symmetrical, organized along a central axis, and are going to reveal the Roman penchant and custom of bathing, first in warm water, or the tepidarium, then hot water, the caldarium, and then finally cold water, the frigidarium, in these baths. So after going through the process of each one of these pools and sitting in them, you could then get out and dry off and enjoy any of the other numerous educational and or athletic activities possible here. The concrete drum would have been circular at the center of this chamber and was taller than that of the Pantheons and almost as large. An impressive open interior space it would have been indeed. But that was not the only part of the Baths of Caracalla. There were these sculpted and landscaped gardens, lecture halls, libraries, exercise courts, or swimming pools. all of which in this massive complex which was free to the public, but however was run in an underground area by slaves, literally showing us the division of Roman labor and civilization. Here we have a cutaway of the structure with these lavish sculptures, including the Farnese Hercules and other statues of gods, inspiring vigorous exercise in those in attendance. The walls, of course, are still very impressive, and we have, inspiring a later basilica here, these side aisles, which are barrel-vaulted chapels. Here we have the copy of the Farnese Heracles by Glycon of Athens, which was paid for, which was commissioned specifically for this location to inspire vigorous exercise so that we would look like Hercules upon finishing our exercise regimen and routine. The original appearance of the Baths of Caracalla can be divined by looking at the frigidarium that survives from the Baths of Diocletian in a church. That's similar in the decoration with the colored marble, the composite capitals, the immense groin vaulting and clear lighting, and or the fenestrated sequence of groin vaults that would let in light to this large interior space that spared no expense in order to ensure Caracalla's legacy would be cemented in history.
In the richly decorated floors and walls, we find mosaics of athletes, and interestingly enough, they foretell what will happen next in Rome. We have the ideal here shown with ancient gladiators and wrestlers, showing that brute force and strength is going to be valued now rather than graceful athleticism. This is going to be the new ideal that would be appropriate for the next emperors that would take charge in Rome, the soldier emperors, because they needed to showcase their brute force in order to keep control, to keep power. Therefore, next time we will look at these soldier emperors and their short-lived rule.